Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into an incredible story of survival. We're looking at how London, facing a terrifying new threat from the sky, went from being almost completely unprepared to building a civil defense system right in the middle of the Blitz. Okay, so let's set the scene. In the 1930s, the fear of an air attack was absolutely massive. And Stanley Baldwin, in Parliament, just laid it out in the most chilling way possible. He basically said, look, there's no hiding from this. The bomber will always get through. And you gotta understand, this wasn't just a dramatic speech, it was what people in power genuinely believed. The attack wasn't a question of if, but when. And this wasn't just some vague public fear. I mean, we're talking about official government committees that were running the numbers. They were predicting what they called a knockout blow from the air, a blow that could cause up to 200,000 casualties every single week. I mean, those are apocalyptic figures. And that fear of total collapse shaped everything that came next. So you'd think with predictions like that, they'd get right to work, right? Well, not exactly. Getting the city ready turned into this slow, painful process that got completely bogged down in arguments over who was in charge and, maybe more importantly, who was going to pay for it all. And this is where it gets really interesting. You had this huge conflict. The central government was telling the local city councils, hey, you need to set up these air raid precautions or ARP schemes right now. But the local leaders, guys like Herbert Morrison over at the London County Council, they basically formed a united front and said, hang on, this is a national defense problem. Why should our local taxpayers have to foot the entire bill? And that political standoff just paralyzed everything for years. So with the officials just arguing back and forth, public information was, well, it was pretty hard to come by. And it often showed up in really unconventional ways, like these. These are collectible cigarette cards, and incredibly, this became one of the main ways that ordinary people could learn the absolute basics of civil defense. You know, what an air raid warden's badge looked like, or how a stirrup pump actually worked. The Munich crisis in 1938, that was the real brutal wake-up call. One of the main ARP organizers, a wing commander named John Hodsell, even called it a godsend, because it just threw a giant spotlight on the truth. London's civil defense was barely there. They had a huge shortage of volunteers, not enough equipment, and no real plan. The year that followed, the Phony War, ended up being a desperately needed last-minute grace period to try and catch up. And then the theories were put to the ultimate test, because in the autumn of 1940, the bombing began for real. This night was a devastating turning point. A massive Luftwaffe fire raid went straight for the heart of the city, right around St. Paul's Cathedral. The goal was simple and terrifying. Create a firestorm so huge it would just completely overwhelm the city's defenses. And for a while, it looked like it was working. The people who saw it, well, they never forgot it. An American journalist, Ernie Pyle, described the horror as a dreadful masterpiece. He wrote about seeing the entire horizon just ringed with fire, creating what he called a ghastly pink ceiling over the city. It was a scene, he said, that was both monstrous and tragically beautiful. So here's the bottom line. The system buckled. The plans that looked so neat on paper just couldn't handle the reality of that much destruction. The biggest failure? Taking care of the thousands of people made homeless every single night. There was just a total lack of coordination, and it created absolute chaos on the ground. And this is where you see just how much leadership mattered, right down to the neighborhood level. It was like a tale of two boroughs. In a place like Poplar, the local MP, Charles Key, provided clear, decisive command, and the services for people after the raids, they actually worked. But right next door in Stepney, the whole system just collapsed under its controversial leader, Councillor Morty Davis. It was chaos, leaving people to fend for themselves while rumors of corruption swirled. But here's the thing about a crisis this huge. It became the very thing that forced radical change. London had to learn and adapt on the fly, forged in the fires of the Blitz itself. The failures led to a big political shakeup. Sir John Anderson was out as Home Secretary. And who did they bring in? Herbert Morrison, the very same tough leader who had challenged the government on funding years before. The press and the public saw him as London's guy, the one who could finally fix the mess. And Morrison's team got to work, fast. They rolled out a whole series of practical, common-sense reforms. They appointed new leaders to tackle specific problems, like homelessness and clearing debris. They set up massive emergency water supplies for the firefighters.
And in a huge move, they finally made the underground official public shelters, something the public had been demanding, and frankly, already doing on their own from the very beginning.
And you can see the change in attitude almost immediately. This cartoon from Punch magazine kind of jokes about it, showing how much the official view on tube shelters had changed. What was once resisted was now being actively managed and even promoted, with canteens and entertainment brought in to try and boost morale. Okay, so the big question is, did all this actually work? Let's look at the final numbers and see how they stack up against those terrifying pre-war fears. Now think about this. Even when brand new terror weapons showed up later in the war, like the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket, the improved civil defense system held. Pre-war estimates for rocket attacks predicted a horrifying 150,000 casualties in a single month. The reality, while still devastating, with around 9,000 deaths from all the V-weapons combined, was nowhere near that predicted collapse. And look at this. This is maybe one of the most striking statistics of the whole war. This is data from the London County Council. In 1941, you were actually more likely to die from cancer in London than from an air raid. It's a really grim piece of context, but it's powerful. It shows that even under constant bombardment, ordinary life and death continued. So the crucial takeaway is this. The civil defense system, a system born from political fights, last-minute improvisation, and really painful lessons, it ultimately did its most important job. It prevented the total collapse of the city and its people. The knockout blow never landed. And this leaves us with a final thought. The story of London's defense during the Blitz really shows that while planning is obviously vital, maybe the true key to resilience is the ability to learn, to improvise, and to reform under the most intense pressure you can possibly imagine.